So thank you all for staying on for this important conversation, and we promise to make this a little bit more uplifting than the last one. And so we're going to try and get not only into defining the challenge of, as Mark said, the panel is called Poverty, the Safety Net, and Building a More Inclusive Economy. I kind of like to think about it as how do we renew the California dream? And so we're going to talk about that in a way that both frames the challenge, which I'm going to introduce our panelists in just a moment, we're going to do that, but then we also really want to engage you in a little bit about what can we do about this so we're not just ending the day in a note of despair. So thank you all for participating in this, and I'm particularly excited to have this fantastic panel with me here today. To my immediate left is Sarah Bohn, who's the Director of Research at the Public Policy Institute of California, where she is a senior fellow and leads a lot of the work at the great Public Policy Institute on the issues that we're going to talk about today. In just a moment, she's going to get up and frame the issue with some facts so that we're all grounded in the basics of the situation. And then what we'll do after that, just to mix it up a little bit, to give you a little bit of post-lunch energy, is I'm going to ask you all, what are the things you want us to talk about? So I'm going to be prepared for a lightning round of not detailed questions, but just ask us, what do you want to hear about? But I want to have Sarah go first to frame that. After that, she'll be followed by Don Howard, who is the CEO of the James Irvine Foundation, where he has led a shift in the foundation's strategy to be focused on this very topic. So he is not only deeply knowledgeable about this, but he's putting the great resources of the Irvine Foundation into solutions. So this will be an important opportunity for Don to talk a little bit about what they're finding, what they know, what they don't know, and what else we ought to be looking for. So thank you for joining us as well, Don. And next to him is Derecka Mehrens. Derecka is the Executive Director of Working Partnerships USA, and she's resident in San Jose in Silicon Valley. She does an enormous amount of work thinking about the opportunities to help build a more inclusive economy by engaging workers and the economy in a way that works for everyone. She's among the most innovative leaders on this topic, not just in Silicon Valley in this part of the world, but in the country. And so I'm sure Derecka will have some creative solutions about how we deal with these challenges in an environment that is complicated, to say the least. So with that, let me turn it over to Sarah. And Sarah, as I mentioned, will give us some facts around the situation and help get us set up. And then I'm going to ask you all for a lightning round of questions, so be ready. Sarah.
Thanks. Honor to participate. We were going to give our comments from the table together, jointly as a team, right? So I'm going to stay seated. But let me know if you can't hear me. So my first couple slides actually reiterate a lot of the themes that we talked about this morning. So I'm not going to belabor them. California's economy is growing. We're in the second longest job expansion on record, growing 200 to 400,000 jobs every year since 2011. And we are also growing fast in terms of GDP. We rank 6th among all states in GDP growth and are growing faster than the US. This is as of 2017. But we rank last in terms of poverty. And Michael Cohen mentioned this at the outset of the day, using Census Bureau estimates of poverty that are, I think, more accurate measures. So what I wanted to focus on is showing you what the family income distribution looks like in California, and that's what this picture is. It's not a bell curve with most families in the middle. In fact, we have about 19% of Californians in families that struggle to meet their basic needs. And this is based on the California Poverty Measure threshold, which is about, on average, $30,000 for a family of 4 in the state. And this is work that PPIC does jointly with the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality, using that same Census Bureau methodology that includes not just the cost of living as a factor, mitigating or hampering families' ability to meet their basic needs, but also all of the safety net program benefits that families receive that are intended to reduce poverty. So 19% of Californians below that threshold, a pretty basic threshold of need. If you go to the other end of the spectrum, kind of the 19 to 20% on the other end of this chart, it's really far away from that bottom 19%. So we're really in a high poverty and high inequality context in California today. And so to me, the issue when I see a jobs report like the one out today is not how many jobs we created, but what were those jobs? What did they offer in terms of wages and opportunities? I'll revisit that idea in a second, but I wanted to show you kind of how we got to this high inequality, high poverty context that we're in right now. And this chart traces incomes in California back to what they were in 1980. And if you follow the bottom lines, that's the bottom 10th percentile, the bottom 10% of families in the across the distribution. Today, they're doing just 3% better in terms of income than they were in 1980. And it's not much better as you go up the spectrum, even to the median family in California, doing just about 10 to 15% better. And that's really just reflecting a few recent years of improvement, not this long 3 decades kind of stagnation. Compare that to at the other end of the distribution, again, the top incomes are now doing 50 to 60% better than they were in 1980. So this really describes the kind of polarization in income and disparate trajectories that we see kind of across the spectrum in California. And it's not because low incomes are not stagnant because families are not working. In fact, poverty in California is really about working poverty. 80% of poor families in California have at least one working adult. So it's really about the jobs that we're working in, and this is a picture of the top 10 jobs that are estimated to drive job growth over the next 10 years or so. And it really reflects kind of what has been happening recently because it's kind of based on historical trends. And when you look down this list, it's not a surprise. You see a lot of healthcare jobs are fast growing, offer a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of service types of jobs, combined food preparation, which is a lot of fast food workers, as well as medical assistants. You see construction on the list as well. And then at the high end, not surprisingly from where we're sitting, software developers are expected to be the third fastest growing job between now and 2026. And actually these top 10 jobs are expected to comprise about a third of new jobs in California over the next 10 years. So to me, it's really another picture of polarized opportunities and how we kind of got to where we are. And so when we think about reducing poverty and increasing mobility, it's really about where are there pathways from some of these low wage jobs up the income spectrum. So what can government policy do to reduce poverty and increase mobility, reduce income inequality? I think there are a lot of opportunities here in government, but government can't work alone and needs other partners like industry as well. The PPIC statewide survey last year asked a representative sample of Californians if they thought that state government what state government should be doing to reduce the gap between rich and poor in California. And 61% believe that government should be doing more, I should say. 32% said no. And of course, there's a partisan divide on this. If you look at the breakdown by party, it's pretty stark. But what the two ways that I think government is most active in addressing poverty and inequality that I want to talk about today are safety net policy and education policy. And this is, I think, where we get to some of the optimistic next steps, potentially. So safety net programs, using the California Poverty Measure research I mentioned earlier, we estimate that safety net programs that are both a constellation of federal and state programs reduce poverty by about 40% in any single year, and actually reduce inequality by about the same margin by lifting up, directly giving resources to poor families, as well as taxing higher incomes. That has the effect of reducing the gap between high and low income families in California. There are ways to actually improve on that safety net poverty reduction by expanding programs, like was mentioned this morning. The California State EITC is one effort to do that directly, or enrolling more eligible participants in programs. In fact, California rates pretty low compared to other states in the share of eligible participants, eligible families for safety net programs that are actually enrolled. So that's kind of oftentimes thought of as free money on the table, especially for federally funded programs like SNAP, the food assistance program. But even in poor families who are receiving safety net benefits from the state and federal government, the majority of the resources that they rely on come from work. And this is not a surprise because the safety net over the same period that we're talking about, over a few decades, has become more and more contingent on work, requiring work to make you eligible for the program. which raises a whole host of questions, especially around the recessions. But work itself doesn't provide a path to middle income jobs, as we've seen through these decades of income trends and labor market trends. So what can safety net programs do that are mobility enhancing, not just requiring work, but helping individuals move into more remunerative positions? And that's where education and training, of course, comes in. And some safety net programs integrate education and training, but not all of them do, and those that do are kind of siloed themselves. But at the same time that we're thinking about safety net interventions, the state has been really investing in prioritizing public education. One of the ways that I think is really important is investments in our community colleges and workforce training around career and vocational education, because these programs circle around the same populations that we worry about, that are stuck in low-wage jobs, that need additional skills, and sometimes they're referred to as stranded workers. And community colleges and these programs target those workers directly, and also target underrepresented groups who traditionally have low levels of educational attainment. And this can go a long way to addressing high poverty rates that we observe across groups in California. So to me, the key really is to think about how the safety net integrates and how well it integrates with educational programs, and then also bringing employers to the table as stakeholders in this, because what we're really talking about is creating a workforce that is highly trained, that's vibrant, that supports business and growth in California, and also making sure that economic opportunity is widespread, so that it's really a draw to California rather than a limitation. And I'll end on that.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. Great brief summary of the context, and I just want to punctuate this with one other statistic that the folks here at Stanford that Sarah's been collaborating with always strikes me as a California kind of challenge and opportunity, is that I graduated from high school the year Prop 13 was passed. Don't do the math, but you can tell how old I am. At that point in time, if you were 30 years old, according to the Stanford researchers, you had a 92% probability of having a better life than your parents. Today, that's a coin flip. That's a 40-point reduction in the likelihood of having a better life than your parents since some of us were in school. That's something that we've got to turn around. So before I ask Don and Derecka to talk a little bit about what they're seeing and what they're doing, I'd like to do just a quick lightning round of what are the handful of things you want to make sure we discuss in the next 45 minutes. And if I could ask you to do just a one or two phrase question, not a commentary, I'd like to take a half dozen questions. So who's got a question they want to see answered? Just raise your hand and say it. Okay, great. All right, those are a great top 10 list. So Don, you get the first 5. No, I'm just kidding.
I was going to say, we have another 2 days for a conference. That's quite an agenda.
But thank you. So again, Don Howard's the CEO of the James Irvine Foundation. So Don, go ahead.
Yeah. For those who don't know our work, the Irvine Foundation's 80-year-old philanthropy. Mr. Irvine owned a significant chunk of Orange County, left about half of it to benefit the people of California, and we're still giving it away completely independent. No company relationship, no family folks involved, and our corpus is worth about $2.3, I don't know what today look like, $2.3 billion. So we have the privilege of giving away about $100 million a year, which is a tremendous responsibility and opportunity. It's also pretty diluted when you think about a state of 40 million folks. In the last 3 years, we've moved to be all in to support low-wage workers and help them have the power to advance economically. And we don't do any work directly, right? We're funders. We're investors in the work of civil society and some public agencies. The goal of sort of moving toward a singular focus really was driven by our observation of the times that we live in. We have been looking at the same data that you've all been looking at all day, and the really important data that Sarah shared, and realized that the future of California depends on our ability to narrow those gaps. We believe that the future of California, our sustainability, our economic prosperity, and our health, and I'd say our social cohesion, depends on supporting our low-wage workers to succeed. And I don't think you had to look past the last federal election to see the effects, antisocial effects of folks being left behind and how that can play out in really unproductive ways. So we've been working hard to figure out how we can use our dollars, our brand, and our reputation to help. First thing we started doing was talking to low-wage workers and asking them, what's their life experience? What are they struggling with? Where do they see opportunities? We recently commissioned a survey of about 3,300 Californians, and using measures regionally of what it took to sustain a family, our calculation was that about 47% of the workers in that sample, about 2,000 of the folks sampled were currently working or looking for work, and of those, 47% were struggling with or in poverty. So when you look at an average California worker, odds on they're having a hard time. And that's a pretty astounding situation to be in, nearly 50%. And if you go to places like the San Joaquin Valley, you're getting up to 60 to 70% of folks are struggling with poverty. And when you look at that subgroup of those who are struggling with poverty, 60% are Latino, 64% are housing unstable or worried about housing, 40% have had to cut back on food to save money, 75% of them say that their employers see them as replaceable. And 80% believe that organizing at work is important for their future opportunities. And I think that last data point is an important one to keep in mind. The sort of evolution of organized labor in our state and in our economy is on people's minds in the front line of work as much as it is in the sort of halls of academia. They were losing hope in the California dream. When we surveyed folks and asked them about, do you expect to do better than your parents? About half of all Californians now say they don't. Fewer than half actually believe they do. 55% say that it's easier to achieve the American dream in a different state. And 64% would encourage young people to leave their communities for better opportunities. I want to also mention that, hold on one second, that when you ask folks about their relationship with government, 70% of those struggling workers believe that public officials don't care what they think, and 63% say voting doesn't matter because they're not listened to. Yeah, this was the uplifting panel. With that, what are the opportunities? What do we see as a way to help? In the midst of that, there are, by calculations by analysts, there are about 1.4 million middle-skilled jobs, what we used to call kind of blue-collar jobs, jobs that require more than a high school degree but less than a college degree that are going unfilled. So we have a 1.4 million job gap. So what we're trying to do, what we think philanthropy can do, is help skill folks up for better work, right? Because we have 2.5 million of these stranded workers that Sarah referred to. That's folks ages 25 to 34 who don't have any college education, but who are in the workforce. 2.5 million folks, 1.4 million jobs. So we went out looking for the best skilling up programs, workforce development programs that place people successfully in these middle skilled jobs. And we found some tremendous organizations. You may know the likes of Year Up, or Jewish Vocational Services, or the Center for Employment Opportunities, which works with folks coming out of the justice system. And we asked them what they needed to scale up their work as rapidly as possible. So we committed at the beginning of this year about $120 million to help the best programs in California to scale up. By our calculations, that should lead to about 25,000 folks being in family-sustaining jobs. And we're psyched and we're saddened because the delta between 25,000 folks and the 2.5 million who need the help is vast. So it takes you quickly out of the civic sector and the nonprofit infrastructure to think about things like the community college. Largest educational system in the world, California's community colleges are a tremendous asset and a very difficult institution for a host of reasons. We're supporting some of their credentialing programs. Sarah's doing some great research with her team on which ones work the best to lift people's earnings, and we're trying to scale those. We're also making a bet along with the state that stranded workers could be best served through an online community college that's statewide. So for folks who weren't covering the last budget, I think 120 million was dedicated to launching a new 115th community college that'll cover the whole state, focused exclusively on skilling up low-wage workers for better jobs. And there's a lot of challenges, as we all know, for online education. But that's one of the things that we're taking some hope in, is that technology, hybrid approaches, technology and in-person, can reduce the cost and scale more rapidly than the more traditional hands-on nonprofit programs. So that's bet number one we're making. The second bet we're making is that we can help workers take home more of what they're due. We were astounded to find out in our work that annually in California, $2 billion of wages that are due to employees, largely minimum wage employees, go unpaid. Sometimes they're called lost wages, sometimes they're called stolen wages. We think about it as wage theft. $2 billion of wage theft a year affects 600,000 minimum wage workers to the tune of $3,400 a worker a year. So you're working in a restaurant, you're making, as you had on your slide, about $25,000 a year, something along those lines. $3,400 of that is not being paid. Often small business relationships, often fudging on minimum wage, on breaks, on overtime pay. Sadly, it's often part of the business model of keeping a small business up and running. The good news is there are a new group of labor organizing efforts called worker centers. I don't know if folks have heard of Restaurant Opportunity Centers or the Warehouse Workers Alliance or the Domestic Workers Partnership. These are nonprofit models of supporting workers with social services, but also supporting them in the workplace. They're partnering with our California Labor Commissioner, Julie Su, on something called the Strategic Wage Enforcement Program and bringing cases to return lost wages. And so we've committed about $80 million to support those worker centers and that partnership. And our hope is that 250 million of that $2 billion can be recouped each year with more strength in worker centers and in that partnership. And the last thing I'll mention is we're beginning to explore housing and how we can return some production numbers in places that are most severely affected by a lack of housing. So we're looking at basically skilling up for jobs, making sure every employee gets to take home the pay they're due, and that we work on the cost of living part of the equation on the housing front. So those are the three levers we've chosen.
Okay, great. And you did cover a number of the questions that were asked. So what we didn't cover after Derecka talks, we'll come back and make sure we hit those. But Derecka, as I mentioned, is Executive Director of Working Partnerships USA, and you have some slides that I think they're up. So Derecka, turn it over to you.
There they are. Good. I'll try to. I may stick to the slides, but I'll try to weave some of this in. My name's Derecka. I started as a community organizer out of college, where I first did work with the Farm Workers Union in Oregon as I graduated from the University of Oregon, and then got hired to do community organizing in low-income communities of color across the country, and spent 10 years doing that work. And for the last 10 years have been running working partnerships and prior to that, doing organizing work with working partnerships. We are a community labor alliance. We believe in the labor movement. We believe unions are good. I'll talk a little bit about that. And I think what I'll do today is talk a little bit about what we see as sort of the drivers of some of the problems that Sarah has outlined and what we see as some of the solutions. We have done work in Silicon Valley, the leading edge of the global economy for 25 years. Our organization was founded by labor folks, faith in the faith community, and progressive folks in Silicon Valley who were recognizing that the Silicon Valley economy simply wasn't benefiting everybody. That's true today. And we think that that's not just about policy, that's about power as well. And about who has a say in changing the rules, and who has, if governance is a team sport, it matters who gets suited up, and that there are folks who are excluded from the sport of governance. And so for many years, we've been organizing with unions, with community partners, both on policy campaigns, but also to really think about what civic society, what sort of community-based organizations, and what sort of labor models like worker centers can help scale worker power in the economy. We see three drivers that are part of the problem in our economy today. This slide just shows that over the last 20 years, 9 out of 10 jobs in Silicon Valley pay less today in real dollars than they did 20 years ago. That's not just in tech, that's across the board. And the first I've already mentioned, we really believe that the decline in political and economic power of everyday workers, but also of those who have been systematically excluded from labor law in this country is a driving problem. So for those who don't know anything about labor law, The National Labor Relations Act, passed in 1930-something, 6, 7, excluded many types of workers. It excluded agricultural workers, domestic workers. It excluded mostly African American workers in the South. And to this day, it excludes those workers. There's a legacy throughout how, who gets access to economic power in the economy, which is what a union is, right? A union is a legal form for workers to collectively come together and require the boss to have a conversation with them about conditions, including wages, right? Many, many workers have been excluded from labor law for decades, and that's an important legacy here. The second driver is the decline in unions and in civil society and civic institutions, and not just the decline, but what I would argue a multi-decade attack on those institutions. By the powerful, by those who see those institutions as a threat. I think the recent Supreme Court case, Janus, which many may not know, but basically means that across the country, public sector workers no longer have the right to have a union and the job, and it made it much harder to organize workers in the public sector. But without I would argue without unions and civil society and organizations that represent everyday people, you can't have a thriving democracy, right? And so that's the second driver. The third, I think, is the erosion of investments in the common good. You know, we talked a lot about Prop 13 today and investments in, whether you're thinking about childcare, you're thinking about our schools. There has been a divestment from the commons, from our ability even to at the local level decide to invest in our roads and infrastructure, right? Prop 13 made it so that you need a 2/3 vote. It made it very difficult for folks who don't have the money to run campaigns to win additional revenue. So we think that building power and building civic infrastructure and building the labor movement of the future is an important endeavor, where there's three different buckets that we're doing this work in. The first is Silicon Valley Rising. It's a community labor coalition that's organizing subcontracted workers in the tech industry. There are tens of thousands of janitors, food service workers, shuttle bus drivers, security officers on tech campuses every day who don't work for Apple, Google, and Facebook. They work for subcontracted companies, and they by and large do not share in the enormous amounts of wealth that is being created on campus. And in fact, our labor laws have made it so that Apple or Google doesn't bargain and cannot bargain with those workers because they're not their employers, right? Even though they ultimately pay the contract that services them. So this campaign has been enormously successful. We've organized over almost 6,000 union members. We think we have a path to another 4,000 or 5,000. That's one of the largest organizing campaigns in the country. It's a partnership with 3 unions. And in part, that is also because not every company is the same, but many tech companies want to solve this problem and actually have been partnering with us. And I would give a shout out to Facebook on that front. They've been excellent partners in the campaign. Gig Workers Rising kind of came out of Silicon Valley Rising. We had more and more of our low-wage workers who were talking to us about how they, on the side, were doing other jobs. Sometimes it's a W-2 job. Sometimes that's just, they're working at, McDonald's, or they're doing a job down the street, at some other employer. Many were starting to say that they were working for Uber or Lyft. In fact, I have a slide. This is Nahima. Nahima is a food service worker at Intel. She helped lead the drive that got her union at Intel. She's a single mom who had it one day. She rented a room in an apartment for her and her 2 daughters. So she could only afford a room, not a full house. And when her landlord, basically the other folks in the apartment, said, you can't have a Christmas tree out here, you got to put it in your room. Basically, she had it. She's decided to move to Modesto. So she now lives in Modesto and commutes 2 hours every day, both ways. So 4 hours a day to work. Again, she works at Intel. And she also drives for Uber and Lyft on the side. So we launched Gig Workers Rising with the acknowledgement that there's an increasing number of jobs in the gig economy, in the platform-based economy, that and we wanted to talk to those workers about how they were cobbling up hours and how they were making it. And so Gig Workers Rising is on the street, organizing those workers collectively and trying to figure out new ways for those workers to build worker power. This is Alicia Redmond. She's one of our activists. The last thing we're doing is really thinking deeply about how technology is shaping work. Somebody mentioned automation. Automation is one impact that technology is going to have on work, and we need to actually understand those impacts. But it's only one. There are other impacts that technology is going to have. So this project, Tech at Work, is with the University of California at Berkeley, their labor center. We've commissioned 5 industry-based studies to tell us how are workers and working people going to be impacted by technologies in real time, and what do we need to do to ensure that workers can still make it in the end of the day and have a voice and a say in the process of automation and as AI and other technologies are rolled out in work. So I think I'll end there and open it up. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to make sure that we cover a couple of topics. We touched on some of them, but
Good.
I want to make sure that we hit some of the other ones that people had raised in the conversation, and anyone can take these. So one of the questions, the last question was around what's the role of business in these issues? Who want to talk about that?
Yeah, this is an area we're exploring really aggressively right now. So we think of ourselves, like to position ourselves as being non-ideological in a sort of political perspective. And we're intentionally investing in skilling up programs that have a lot of partnerships with employers and that are really employer-serving in many ways. And we're simultaneously investing in worker centers to help make sure these wage cases get brought and they get paid what they're due. And we're building that sort of part of civil society. Strategically, it was quite intentional to try to be at the intersection to see if we can bridge some of the divide and bring people into some common pursuits. We've been setting up a series of employer conversations. I've done a few individual ones. And what I'm most impressed with is, you know, the likes of like a PG&E, Chevron, Salesforce, UPS, AT&T. In California, you talk to them, they're very aware of the worker shortage. They realize their business prospects are jeopardized by the lack of skilled workers. And they worry about the growing economic divide in our state from a business perspective and the risk that poses to their sustainability and their profitability. They're struggling with how to do it. Unfortunately, too many of them got out of the business of skilling up workers internally when the kind of long-term social contract of employment moved to a more temporary sort of employment pattern. Folks stopped doing the professional development training programs of yore. They're getting back to it. I mean, UPS has now an internal university that they're trying to do. Salesforce is committed to a lot of apprenticeships that they're trying to do. They want to partner with community colleges and struggle. I hope this online community college gives them a place they can plug in at a scaled fashion to get it done. What we're hoping to see, and I'm keen if anybody is in this category, a group of business leaders who want to commit to shared prosperity for California, who see that our future as a state depends on greater inclusivity and the sharing of the spoils of our growth. And I believe those folks are out there, and that kind of civic leadership, business and civic leadership, needs to be embraced and cultivated and lifted up and grown. And that's one of the goals we have, hopefully, with our work going forward.
Derecka, can I ask you that question as well? Because you mentioned you're partnering with tech businesses in particular to try and, what are you doing practically and how's that going?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things we're doing. I mean, one thing, you know, business and labor is the like eternal like debate. It's business versus labor. Unions can't exist without employers. So like from my perspective, the civil discourse aside, like we have to figure out how business and labor and business and its workers can communicate about some of these tough challenges. So there's a couple of ways we're doing that. One is as we are organizing workers, we're not just engaging the subcontracted companies, because frankly, nobody cares if Compass is getting paid, the food service company, by Facebook or it's actually not Facebook, but by whomever, right? We're engaging the companies in a conversation about their procurement policies. These are actually policies that somebody has to sign a contract with a subcontractor, right? And we've seen many of these companies step out in the last few years with voluntary policies like offering paid sick days to their subcontracted workers and their workers and their contract workers. Facebook did a $15 minimum wage before anybody else did. The problem that the next step in that is that those are often voluntary. So we talk to workers all the time who say, yeah, they say they're supposed to pay me $15, but they don't. I don't get paid for my breaks. And there's no incentive for that worker to complain to the company, because then they'll fire the contractor and then they lose their job. So there's no recourse, right? There's no leverage, there's no bargaining leverage, there's no place of safety and stability for the worker to go. So responsible contracting practices are a big one that we're asking about.
Okay. Sarah, I want to ask you a question, since you've looked at a lot of these around the impact of minimum wage, child care topics. You want to talk a little bit about what you're finding and perspectives on those?
Sure. Maybe I'll tackle the childcare one first, because I actually kind of meant to mention that earlier. But when we think about how we could retrain workers who are stranded, who are low income, they're mostly working adults with families. And so thinking about, I feel like the number one solution that I would look towards is a way to help people maintain their work while also being able to invest in their education. And that goes to working employers being willing to work on that, as well as supports that help working students do both. And childcare is probably the number one thing, but transportation as well. And financial aid policy, which we don't need to get into, is a big part of that as well. So I think that's really part of the key, needing a constellation of supports to help these investments make sense for families who are working but struggling with poverty. On the minimum wage side, I will say that we have done some simulations of what the increasing minimum wage will look like in terms of poverty reductions and how that might matter across the state. And it can have a major impact on poverty. There are a lot of questions around increasing the minimum wage as a strategy to reducing poverty, in part because a lot of minimum wage workers are actually not in poverty. They might be younger workers in families that are not in poverty to begin with. So it's not as well targeted, I would say, as other interventions like tax credit programs, like the California's new earned income tax credit program. I find to be a bit better targeted. That's not to say that addressing kind of the minimum wage that we are willing to accept as a society isn't an important conversation. And even if it comes with some job loss, which there's still plenty of economists who believe that is the case, that's still not necessarily something we should write off because of that.
Okay, great. I'm going to cover 2 or 3 more of these that we did in the lightning round, and then we'll open it up for anyone else that wants to ask something that wasn't in the lightning round. So I want to ask whoever wants to cover it the question, looking back a little bit, around what impact do neighborhood design, criminal justice system, inherent racism, other issues that are much more fundamental and long-term. Who wants to talk about that?
Such a big set of topics.
Yes.
I mean, here's some practical on the there have been some, I think, really important reforms in our criminal justice system, and what we're seeing are some exciting new efforts to train up folks who are coming out of the justice system for better work, for real careers. I point to the Center for Employment Opportunities, evidence-based, great randomized controlled trial data. They're doing a great job of it, and they're doing it with a lot of public money as part of the subsidy, so they're doing it for a good price per outcome. And then others like the Anti-Recidivism Coalition in Los Angeles that's working with the LA Labor Fed has an exciting sort of new effort underway. So we see it as sort of a need to retrain and reintegrate folks coming out of the justice system as hopefully some of the more common sense reforms take hold.
Okay. There was another topic around neighborhood design and housing and those sort of topics around access to being able to afford to live in California, have opportunity to be part of that opportunity to grow your well-being. Anyone want to comment on what has any promise in that vein, or how do you think about it?
I can add one piece of information from my point of view, just because there clearly are regions that are economically depressed and where opportunities are more limited. And I think there's a whole host of concerns and potential maybe solutions. But one that we look to in the education realm is to the community colleges, because they are located all across the state. They're well located, well targeted in that sense, and improving the way that they design their programs of study that lead to in-demand jobs in that region is there's a lot of room for improvement there. As a report, as Don mentioned, we released just a couple weeks ago from PPIC showed there were not a lot of great, well thought out designs to get students to better careers across the institutions. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement there, and it can address at least some of the differential opportunities across regions in the state. That's my hope.
I guess I would add one more thing, just which is, it's a problem really, but I don't believe we can fundamentally solve the problem of poverty and inequality without also addressing the housing crisis, especially in California and the Bay Area. I mean, our low-wage workers who talk to us, and they're organizing at work, right? So they're primarily coming together around workplace issues. The first thing they say to us is, what can we do about housing costs? Because it doesn't matter if they get $1 or $2 more an hour if their rent goes up $700, right? Like, so I think one thing we have to do on that front is really think deeply about looking at segregation in place, occupational segregation, and then housing segregation as a lens on those issues, and figuring out the long-term solutions that really cut it access to opportunity within them, and that's a really tough nut to crack.
Okay. 2 more questions, then I'm going to open it up in the remaining 10 minutes we have. Looking forward, and Derecka, I'll let you start with this one since you're spending a lot of time in that part of the world around the impact of automation, new modes of work. What I know you touched on a little bit around gig work, but it's broader than that. What are you seeing or thinking about that? And Sarah, I know you're doing some research on this topic too.
Yeah. The first thing that I'm trying to really do is get beyond the rhetoric of the robots coming.
Yeah.
The robots are coming, and it's being developed right here. I mean, AI, I'm not saying that any of that is unreal, but it is, one thing I think we have to do is get really rigorous about what's happening today and what's not, and where are job losses going to be offset by job creation. And then what are those impacts? How are those impacts going to reorganize industry or not? And try to anticipate that as best we can, the likely adoption scenarios, and work together to mitigate them. So we commissioned a study recently called Driverless by a professor out of University of Pennsylvania who's an expert in long-haul trucking, to look at, who both has worked with unions but also has worked with companies like Uber and Starsky and Peloton, and to basically asked him, Steve, tell us what the most likely adoption scenario is for automated vehicles in the trucking context, because this is a really big number of workers that are likely to be impacted. Long story short, yes, there will be job losses, and in fact, those job losses will have political and demographic implications, particularly in red states and in rural areas where sometimes a truck driving job is the middle class job, especially for men. And those jobs are the most likely jobs to be automated at first, are going to be those long haul jobs. He also said there's going to be massive job creation on the local front, especially in urban centers where e-commerce and other drivers in retail are going to be pushing the Amazon Flexes of the world to create more gig, short-term, short-haul employment. Now, if we offset good jobs in rural areas with more jobs in urban areas but crappy jobs, there are impacts, political, demographic, right? And so I feel like what we have to do is get rigorous about the information and then get people together across silos, labor, business, policymakers, academics, and start to solve them.
I'll add, from our perspective, the same skilling up is part of the solution here. Having better systems, more robust relationships with employers, more flexibility, faster turnaround to new credentialing programs will help that retraining that needs to happen to help folks navigate as automation comes our way. So we're, betting again that that's an important part of the solution to this. We're also kind of not betting on UBI and the universal basic income, which is you can easily get focused on something, grand silver bullet far out in the future. We're really focused on this generation and the next.
I think that was so well said. I would just reiterate that our educational institutions need to be more responsive to the labor market needs even today. And I guess I'm hopeful that the work that's going on in them to do that will maybe lay the groundwork to continue that as things will continue to change and be dynamic.
Okay, great. And my last question, and then we're going to open it up. California is the 5th largest economy in the world. We kind of operate like a nation in a lot of ways. The topics that we're talking about, I know, Sarah, you mentioned from the beginning that some of the perspectives tend to be partisan, but I'm going to portray my perspective from the beginning that a lot of these issues are actually not partisan. It's about how do you get them solved. And Zabri Valentine is sitting in the back there, has been convening a group called the Economic Mobility Collaborative, people in California who are working cross-partisan, cross parts of the state, cross sectors, and there's actually more commonality and alignment around this issue. It's more, what do we do about it? So that was a long-winded way to ask you, is there a possibility that this can be solved in a nonpartisan way, in a cross-sector way? Is that, or am I just smoking something that's now legal in California?
Is that your next business opportunity after the brewing company?
They can't be combined.
I don't think it can be solved otherwise. I think one interesting dynamic that we've been observing is as the national conversation has become so polarized and so uncivil, that interestingly, in contrast, California in some sense almost feels more united in a way. So some of the common ground here may be kind of coming together in light of like a contrast or in opposition or maybe resistance to what's going on nationally. There certainly seem to be enough folks trying at that intersection to work on issues. I wish we saw our political parties doing more of it, frankly, but I see individuals and institutions that are together. It's now lifting them up so that more can follow them.
Okay. Then we'll leave that as a yes, it can be solved in California. So we've got 5 more minutes, so let me open it up. Yes.
A question for Derecka and maybe also for Don. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to what you see as like best practices for engaging the business community in terms of solving some of these top problems, whether it's upskilling or the housing affordability issue, and like what you found has worked or hasn't.
Here's what we're betting, is that it's not about corporate social responsibility. It's about business profitability and sustainability, and that these are core business challenges, whether it's the declining middle class in your consumer base or whether it's the lack of a workforce to do what needs to be done in your company and innovate the way you want to innovate. So the conversations we're having are framed very much around the core business strategy of the institutions.
Can I add one thing to that as a moderator's prerogative? Because one of the things that I agreed to do on this panel was talk a little bit as a former business advisor. My advice would be, and experience has been, don't think about business as monolithic. And don't think about the institutions, think about the executives and connect with someone who wants to engage. And there are many business leaders in this region, in this state, who are very engaged in these issues, and they're looking for a way to do it constructively.
You kind of took my point because
Sorry.
where our best conversations start with humans, laying out your perspectives, and then where we have common ground, especially around the housing issues, we start there. We don't go right to, hey, we're organizing your workers, right?
A little addendum to that, right? A little addendum, which is, there are places of common ground, even when there might be other parts of the business model that we might disagree with. So what I struggle with, interestingly, with some of our colleagues internally, some of our grantees, is Walmart's doing some interesting stuff with their frontline employees. And people say, how could you be talking to Walmart? Like, we're going to find areas of common ground, we're going to work on them, and we'll expand from there. And I think we have to let down our sense of like, you're with me or you're against me, and start looking for the places we overlap.
Great, yes.
It seems to me that a lot of the discussion today has been focused on Silicon Valley and urban problems. And I would like to contrast that with the situation in urban California versus rural California, which in my mind is completely different. There's also been a lack of focus on undocumented and the fact that a lot of agricultural workers are undocumented, still are undocumented. I'm not negative on that, but I'm just saying it's another one of these factors. But there are some new economic incentive programs in California to stimulate the economy in underdeveloped areas. And I've heard no discussion about those sorts of things. It would seem that beating the crap out of Silicon Valley for being so successful is really a diminishing kind of returns. And the problems with housing costs and so forth and so on are a direct function of our success here. So what are we doing about the rest of California?
Okay. You mean the world doesn't end at Silicon Valley? Who wants?
We actually do a disproportionate amount of our work in the inland parts of California. We actually don't do a ton of work in the Bay Area with so much philanthropy here. We choose to be more in Fresno, Riverside, San Bernardino, Salinas, and such. I'd say some of the dynamics are quite the same. Like Fresno has one of the lowest vacancy rates for rental units in the nation. They have a severe housing problem right now. Their market doesn't reward construction, given the relatively low costs of housing, so they are acutely short of units for folks to live in. They also have a tech boom going on in Fresno with some entrepreneurs and some incubators that have gotten started there, particularly tech for agriculture and clean tech. There's also, I think, a really exciting opportunity there for entrepreneurs and particularly small businesses and micro lending for small businesses. No, in fact, I believe Fresno, given the lack of resources, needs more help than others. It's one of the fastest growing places in the state. We've also got the bullet train, which may change things if it gets built and change the dynamics. So I guess I would just push back that there's similar dynamics. The numbers may be different, it may be more one thing than another, but this isn't just a coastal California problem. This is actually as much, if not more so, an inland California problem.
Sarah, did you want to comment on either of those questions? Because I know you're doing research on both of them.
Yeah, I'll just add that kind of closing the workforce skills gap, the millions of workers that will be needed in the future for positions that require a college degree or some training beyond high school, can really mostly be made up by improving outcomes in inland California, the Inland Empire and Central Valley being two of the major ones, just because of kind of the demographics and the differences in educational attainment, which I know somebody in our lightning round did raise. And so that's why not just improving education overall, but especially improving educational outcomes for underrepresented minority groups, first-generation students, is really key to closing the workforce gap that we'll be facing.
Okay, great. Yes, in the back.
California actually has a lot of attractive areas in the Inland Empire that basically do have space and do have low-cost housing, and it does have low-cost real estate and a ready workforce, probably, but needs some uptraining. But why don't California companies move to those spaces? Why do they go somewhere else when they want to relocate their spots? Is it because is there a tension between the state being the 50th worst business location and that issue?
So I can try some of that because to look at it and also suggest that there's a big opportunity there. The primary reason that, in my view, that people don't is mindset, not lack of economic incentive to do it. So Michael Weinberg at the Bay Area Council Economic Institute is doing a study now on the connection between the Central Valley and Silicon Valley and the Bay Area. And one of the major opportunities is to think about the opportunity. Why are inside salespeople at Oracle who make $75,000 a year sitting in corporate headquarters on the 101 and driving for 2 hours or sit in traffic? Why couldn't those people doing 75,000-hour jobs sitting in a building be doing those in Fresno or San Bernardino? They could. And that part happens. So most of what happens now is the first mindset is take everything out of California. Or even out of the country. Turns out when you actually do the math, there's not that much of a difference in terms of those costs to do some of those high-value jobs within California, and the proximity can be very valuable for the fact of hosting it there. So I do think there are It's a deliberative approach to deal with those. They're not going to come naturally, and it's not going to be true for certain types of low value added jobs that could be done in another part of another state or another part of the country, but that's not true for a large number of jobs.
So there's a lot of gaps in civil society and amenities and the things that drive people to places that keep folks out. San Bernardino is a very troubled city, recently out of bankruptcy, tremendous issues of poverty and substance use and mental health. I don't think many business executives would pick it as a place they want to live, to start to have their businesses. So we need to help those cities be stronger, to be more attractive places for investment.
Yes. And trust me, that's at the top of the list of the mayor of Stockton and the mayor and head of the community foundation in Fresno. That's at the top of their list. Yes.
About the sort of political voice and building that political power in terms of what you're doing. I mean, what you said is really important. It's primary, like getting a good job, fighting where you are. But then on a certain level, if there's no respect for these groups politically, then the state, the local, the federal governments are not going to listen and try to do things. And then the side question would be, I've always wondered, why hasn't there ever been really a viable workers' party in this country? And are you guys, is that part of your strategy too?
I love that. He's a plant for me. Part of the reason I didn't answer the partisan question is because I sort of think the system's broken, right? I'm not a fan of either party. I think that's a great question. So one, I feel very hopeful. So it may have been spurred by a partisan election in 2016 at the federal level, but we have seen, as an I've seen more people come out to whether it's a march or just to be to step out for the tech workers that are organizing right now. The women's movement right now is, as a feminist, is more active than ever. I feel like people are searching for new forms of organizing. Whether that's, what does the labor movement of the future look like, to what's the tenants' rights movement is very robust right now. I think women are starting to think differently and form new organizations. More women are running for office than ever. So I think there's something to that. And I think part of our job is to give people avenues to self-organize and then help them think strategically about getting in front of policymakers and on their issues. So I think that's one. Two, that's a big question about party politics in the United States and a two-party system. And I think one of the things that I think is one of the most interesting partisan experiments that's been happening for a few years is fusion voting and the Working Families Party in New York, which is now in multiple states, where you can run on a ballot line and be a part of one party, but you can run on the Democratic Party line as a Working Families Party candidate. I think that's an interesting electoral model. But that's a nut we got to crack. I mean, I think that's why you're seeing a lot of socialists like women and others come out and say they're running, right? It's because it's broken.
We have a very balanced board in terms of partisan affiliations and such, and we have chosen to invest about 10% a year in civic engagement across the state, various forms, because we believe, as we talk about giving low-income workers the power to advance economically, that's both about skills, but it's also about voice, and it's about having the policy context within which the market operates, reflecting the needs of everyone, not just those who purvey capital. So we have been investing in that activity. We don't take policy positions. We don't encourage them to do a specific thing, but we believe that infrastructure is really important to have a democracy that works.
Okay, I hate to do this. This topic could go on for the rest of the afternoon if we'd allow it, but we're unfortunately at that time where we have to stop. Again, I'd like to thank my panelists, Sarah Bohn, Don Howard, and Derecka Mehrens, for raising a set of both challenges for the state, but also some ideas about what we might be able to do to think about making our safety network better, improving the opportunity for Californians, making it easier and less cost to live and move around here, and raising the voice and power of those who can advocate for that and work across the state, across sectors to help make that happen. So we are now going to take a 15-minute break, and we will start promptly at 10 after 4. And what we're going to do is give you a chance to have some cookies for a little sugar and some coffee in the back before you go. So please join the panel, me in thanking the panel.